And welcome to the April 18th Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee. I'm John Borofsky. I'm a co-chair, I guess, whatever we are calling myself today. We have a pretty interesting agenda tonight. We'll start off with our Zoom protocols and rules. Do we have anybody in the waiting room?
We do have an attendee tonight, but we are not taking public comment orally right now. So,
Okay. Yeah, so just for the person who's attending, if they do have questions or want to give testimony, submit it to staff and they'll make sure that we get it. And we'll go from there. After that, we have agenda review. Does anybody have any changes or updates to the agenda that you want to make? Hearing none. I don't see in the agenda that you want us to approve any minutes. Are we going to wait and do that at another time?
there are minutes to approve, but since there's only 5 of you right now, we won't do that at the
Okay.
moment.
All right. Well, then I'm going to just go ahead and move on to the second item on the agenda, which is urban growth strategies and the CFAC overall.
So Sue has her hand up.
Okay.
Yep, go ahead, Sue.
Thank you. I just wanted to say quickly that I need to leave a few minutes before 7 for another Zoom meeting. So I will be departing probably at about 6 or 7 minutes before 7. Thank you.
Oh, I'm going to have this thing wrapped up way before that. All right. Let's go ahead with Leah.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you all. Thanks for having us. So I was here a few months ago, but as a reminder, I'm Leah Rausch. I'm a planner in community planning and design, and I'm mostly working on urban growth strategies, which we gave you kind of a primer on back in, I think, December it was. So we're coming to you tonight with a couple of specific components that we've been working on over the last few months. I am going to start the evening with a presentation on climate-friendly areas, which will be, I'll get into more, but will be one of our land use efficiency measures as part of the climate-friendly and equitable communities rulemaking. I'm going to give you that little bit of background. We'll pause and talk through any questions or thoughts you have on the work we've done so far, but our hope is to spend the bulk of our time talking about the redevelopment analysis. So we have Becky Hewitt here from Echo Northwest, who is our technical consultant on this work. We wanted to give you all the climate-friendly areas background to kind of inform what Becky is going to share with you about the redevelopment analysis. So we'll give her the bulk of the meeting and make sure you have lots of time for questions and feedback. With that, I'm going to share my screen and I will jump in. So, as I think you all probably know or have heard little bits about, the city has been working to implement climate-friendly and equitable communities, or CFEC, for the last year and a half or so now. So this is a state-directed effort to meet Oregon's climate action goals specifically through changes to local transportation and land use planning systems. So we're working to align the requirements of CFEC with some of our ongoing work, kind of within the urban growth strategies kind of bucket, as well as the city's other initiatives around climate action, housing production, and transportation. So I'm not going to get into all the background on CFEC today, but we did provide some background on the rules in the memo that was shared for this meeting. We're going to talk most specifically about just one aspect of CFEC implementation, which is the designation of what are called climate-friendly areas. So I'll give you, as I mentioned, some of this background in advance of our conversation on the redevelopment analysis. Climate-friendly areas are one of our primary land use efficiency measures that we expect to use during this ongoing and upcoming urban growth planning work. So I'll start with a little bit of a review of our study of climate-friendly areas and then share a summary of the 9 of what are called suitable areas that we identified through the study. And I'll define exactly what that means a little later on. The study itself doesn't identify or designate specific areas as CFAs, but it was really helping us to evaluate some of the more promising areas. And we believe the selection of CFAs will be informed by the results of the redevelopment analysis. So to get right into it, what is a climate-friendly area? So again, this is a state designation, and a climate-friendly area is intended to be an area where people can meet most of their daily needs without relying on a car. So they're more urban, they're mixed use, they contain or plan to contain a pretty high density of housing, jobs, businesses, and services. And they're areas that are served or planned to be served by high quality walking, biking, and transit infrastructure. So there are some specific levers we'll pull by designating a CFA. We'll update our housing and transportation plans for these areas to, have that opportunity for more dense and increased mixed use development. We'll identify and prioritize improvements that make it easier and safer for people to walk, bike, and take transit to their destinations within these areas. And then we'll also look at strategies to avoid or minimize displacement of our residents who are vulnerable to housing instability or housing discrimination, as well as look at how we can preserve and increase affordable housing options within these climate-friendly areas. So our process to actually designate these areas has three kind of major steps. So the first is the study I mentioned. In 2023, we identified and studied the most promising locations for climate-friendly areas across the city. So tonight I'll go through the kind of components of the technical analysis in more detail, but this work also included coming up with a community engagement approach, as well as doing a displacement risk analysis. The second step, which we're beginning this year, is to actually select our climate-friendly areas. So that will include community engagement, a recommendation from the Planning Commission, and direction from City Council. Adoption of the CFAs will, we expect, kind of require amendments to the land use code as well as to our comprehensive plan. Finally, CFA designation is not intended to be static, so we'll have to relook at these as one of our land use efficiency measures every 8 years, or every time we revisit the UGB now, which is required for housing at least every 8 years. So we may need to designate additional CFAs or expand our CFAs to maintain kind of a threshold capacity. So per the rules, we're required to maintain a threshold of zoned capacity for at least 30% of Eugene's current and future housing needs within climate-friendly areas. So I want to get into the study in a little bit more detail. So we use kind of a narrowing process for this study. So starting citywide and really narrowing down based on the criteria that are in the rules or otherwise kind of recommended for this process. So at a high level, I want to summarize what our approach looked like. So in this kind of citywide scan, this first step, we looked at a few different factors. So we looked at where our urban centers exist or are planned based on our zoning, and we narrowed that to within the urban growth boundary. We looked at the current presence of high quality transit access or frequent transit. And we looked at areas where development is allowed based on goal 7, which is kind of natural hazards and disasters. The second stage included a few different analyses. So we narrowed to our suitable areas based on certain criteria that are in the state rules. We assessed how far each of those areas got us in terms of achieving that housing goal or that threshold of 30%. And then evaluating each of the suitable areas based on other required and recommended criteria. So this is a stage where we also looked at the anti-displacement analysis to help us understand how CFA designation might increase displacement pressures and what tools we can use to mitigate that pressure, those displacement risks. The final stage, so the CFA study itself, is a summary of all of our technical analysis in that process. And as I mentioned, it does not include a final kind of preferred CFA configuration, but really is an evaluation of our most promising options. So I'll show you a few maps to get a sense of what these areas look like. So this is a map of that first stage of the analysis when we looked citywide. This is looking at 4 factors. This is our existing or planned urban centers by zoning, which is in red. We looked at high quality or frequent transit and within a half-mile walking distance of frequent transit. So that's in the purple. Development not restricted by goal 7. So because, as you all know, Eugene allows development in the floodplain and on steep slopes with certain considerations or mitigation measures. The only area we actually excluded was the FEMA floodway. And then we again looked inside the urban growth boundary. When you overlay all of those together, you get this. This is showing the intersection of those 4 criteria across the city. And then our next stage was to narrow to our suitable areas really based on their size. So Eugene has to designate at least one climate-friendly area, which includes kind of the most intensive development standards in the rules. We also have the option to designate additional what are called secondary climate-friendly areas with less intensive development standards. So importantly in this analysis, we were looking for kind of contiguous areas with distinct land use requirements that had to meet a minimum width of 750 feet. So we saw some gray area in the rule about how the state was defining minimum width. So we took 2 different kind of definitions of this. And the width is important because we've identified several of our transit corridors as suitable CFA locations. This is in alignment with Envision Eugene and our community vision. So this map shows the results of both methods citywide. So the areas in yellow did not meet either of the minimum width definitions, so are considered non-suitable. The orange areas are meet the minimum suitable width, and the brown areas are locations that meet kind of a more optimal width. We chose for the rest of the study to retain both of the optimal and the suitable locations. So subsequently, I'll refer to all of those as suitable climate-friendly areas. So this is what that looks like when we narrow out the non-suitable areas of the city. So we end up with kind of 9 contiguous areas that are shown here. And as you can see, there's a lot of alignment with our community vision for key transit corridors and core commercial areas. They're also fairly well distributed across the city. So then our next step was to kind of evaluate each of these areas using some of the additional criteria that are either required in the CFAC rules or otherwise recommended by DLCD. These are the criteria that we use to kind of assess how promising each area was. So I've mentioned displacement risk a couple of times. We're looking at if the area shows signs of risk based on the presence of vulnerable people and also kind of the conditions of the housing market. We're looking at development regulation compliance. So does the area's existing zoning comply, or can it be brought into compliance with the land use requirements for CFAs? Dwelling unit capacity. So this is about that 30% threshold. Does the area zoning allow it to achieve the zoned residential building and dwelling unit capacity that's required for CFAs? That's a zoned capacity, so regardless of what's currently on the ground. High density mixed use areas. So is the area within or near areas planned for or provided with high density residential uses and a high concentration of employment opportunities? Parks and public amenities. Does the area have or is it near sufficient parks and other public amenities? Would it be appropriate to site facilities providing public services within the area? High quality active transportation facilities. Again, is the area served or planned to be served by high quality walking and biking infrastructure? Served by adequate infrastructure? Can the area's power, stormwater, water, and wastewater infrastructure support the land use requirements for CFAs? And then redevelopment potentials or redevelopment conditions. Can we expect the area to redevelop or develop at a level that will support our housing production and employment goals? I'm not going to go through each of these criteria today. I want to focus us on development regulation compliance as that informed kind of our selection of study areas for the redevelopment analysis. And we'll end with kind of a snapshot of how each of these 9 areas compare based on these criteria. So I mentioned that we kind of the very first stage of this was to look at urban areas based on current zoning. So our suitable CFAs in the study look at our stretch across 13 base zones and special area zones. So they each have distinct land use requirements. So we did an evaluation that considered existing zoning and development regulations and how many changes would need to be made to bring those into compliance, or those areas into compliance with CFA standards. So the study focuses on a couple of the most meaningful development regulations, but those are not the only ones in the rules. So I'll highlight a few of what we think are the most meaningful ones. So outright permitted uses. CFAs have to allow both single use and mixed use development, as well as certain outright permitted uses. So multi-unit residential, attached single unit residential, office uses, non-auto dependent retail services and other commercial, childcare, schools, and public uses, including public serving government facilities. And then importantly, I think for the purposes of our evaluation, any development that requires approval through a land use application process, so a site review, a planned unit development, or a conditional use permit, we didn't consider to be kind of outright permitted. The other most relevant development standards relate to minimum residential densities and building heights. So the study relies on what are called the prescriptive standards presented in the CFAC rules, which again allow us to look at a primary CFA, which has a minimum residential density of 25 dwelling units per net acre and a maximum building height of no less than 85 feet throughout. We have the option to designate as secondary CFAs, which have that lower intensity, so a minimum residential density of 15 dwelling units per net acre and a maximum building height of no less than 50 feet throughout. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on those primary CFA standards, which we know we're required to use for at least one area. The short of it, in terms of the results of this evaluation, are that our existing commercial zones, so specifically C2 and C3, are most compliant with CFA standards. C1 and general office, our other less intense kind of commercial zones, are moderately compliant. The big changes in C2 and C3 would be introducing minimum residential densities, as well as making sure the listed uses are outright permitted. So in some places they're affected by site review or PUD overlays. Both R3 and R4, so our limited and high density residential areas, are less compliant than our commercial zones, mostly because of those outright permitted uses. So to be CFA compliant, those zones would need to allow office uses, non-auto oriented commercial and retail services, schools, and childcare facilities. Additionally, R3 throughout the city has some height limitations, including south of the UO campus. So designation would require potentially an increase to allowable building heights. And finally, both zones would need to increase minimum residential densities and remove their existing maximum densities. Again, that's in R3 and R4. That's a super quick version of the development regulations. Taking all of that information into consideration, we want to provide some way to compare the suitable CFAs to each other. So we took 6 of the criteria in the rules and ranked the top 3 areas by each of those criterion. There are certainly other considerations that are not noted here or that we'll want to do some continued analysis or research on. So just quickly, in terms of development regulation, the most compliant areas are those dominated by C2 with fewer overlay zones that reduce the outright permitted uses. In terms of dwelling unit capacity, again, we're required to designate enough acres as CFAs to meet that 30% of our current and future housing needs. This is zoned capacity, so it basically doesn't consider what's on the ground today. So ultimately, it's looking at what are the biggest of these areas. Right now, downtown campus is our largest area, followed by West 11th and Highway 99. In or near mixed use areas, so several of these suitable areas are existing or planned mixed use areas, including downtown, Ferry Street Bridge, the Franklin Walnut area. These areas also have fewer non-compliant adjacent uses, so less like low density residential or industrial surrounding them. Parks and open space. Most of these areas have adequate parks and amenities, but downtown South Willamette and Franklin Walnut kind of stood out for their access. High quality active transportation. So of course, downtown and the areas adjacent to the University of Oregon generally have high quality active transportation facilities. We also have scheduled improvements to Franklin Boulevard so that Franklin Walnut area kind of rises up. South Willamette has also seen some recent improvements, and it's a smaller cross section, so it's just 3 lanes as compared to some of our other transit corridors that are much wider. And of course, development and redevelopment conditions, that's what we're here to talk about tonight. This ranking does not include the results of the redevelopment analysis. It's really just a cursory look at our recent permit data and available lands. So I think you all know housing downtown is a big priority for the city, expressed through urban renewal and our downtown planning work. The downtown campus CFA is pretty big. It encompasses the riverfront and areas around campus that are already redeveloping pretty rapidly. So that one definitely rose to the top. We also know there's some, additional potential in the Santa Clara station. There's some existing vacant or partially vacant areas kind of around that, including the LTD surplus site. And then West 11th also has some kind of undeveloped areas within and adjacent to the CFA boundaries. So super high level. We're looking forward to digging into this more deeply in the redevelopment analysis. So just quickly, I'll talk about some next steps and then I'll hand it off. But we've mentioned a few times the designation of climate-friendly areas is going to be folded into the Urban Growth Strategies project. So I'll just call out a few specific points of integration. So we're working on our housing production strategy, which will identify and prioritize actions to provide housing that is affordable to all. This may include policy measures or incentives to encourage more housing development in some key areas. Climate-friendly areas designation is one tool in our toolbox for more compact development within the UGB. So we're excited as a part of Urban Growth Strategies to kind of look at all of our tools together and figure out which to apply in which areas to advance our vision. Climate-friendly areas are a policy measure, as I've mentioned, a land use efficiency measure to more efficiently develop land within the UGB. And because it's a mixed use development tool, CFA designation will be both a residential and an employment efficiency measure. To use CFAs as a land use efficiency measure, we want to have kind of this quantitative analysis that looks at the number of units we can expect CFA designation to support. And so the redevelopment analysis will help us to explore that potential for increased redevelopment, as well as what other incentives we might want to introduce to encourage more housing or mixed use development alongside kind of the required zoning changes. Then at a policy level, CFAs will be implemented through the comprehensive plan. So as a part of phase 2 of the comprehensive plan, we'll expect to include some CFA relevant policies in the housing, compact development, and community health chapters. And there will also be a kind of a CFA designation map within the comprehensive plan. And then finally, throughout all of urban growth strategies, we're really looking at a coordinated community engagement strategy to bring kind of all of this work wrapped up to the public in one nice package. So I'll hand it off to Becky in a little bit here to talk through the redevelopment analysis in more detail, but briefly want to share kind of the purpose, which is to evaluate redevelopment potential in our selected study areas, to understand needed financial incentives to encourage higher density mixed use and housing development, and to test a range of development types across a range of local markets and rents. So for the redevelopment analysis, we really started from our suitable CFAs and wanted to look at what the most appropriate study areas were to analyze. So this map shows actually the study areas. You'll see it looks somewhat similar to the CFA map, but a little bit different. So we did make some modifications going into the redevelopment analysis. So we removed areas that were less compatible with CFA designation or would require more significant regulatory changes. So it's like some of those lower density residential areas, as well as far west 11th, the Whitaker neighborhood, some others. We removed 3 areas that are already being redeveloped under current conditions. So downtown riverfront is ongoing redevelopment. Walnut Station, that Franklin Walnut area has seen a lot of redevelopment recently, as well as kind of the areas west of the UO campus, as well as at Chase Village. We segmented some CFAs into distinct sub-areas with different existing zoning or policy alternatives to test. So we broke apart downtown into kind of 4 distinct areas. So looking at the downtown core, kind of the greater downtown, that donut around the core, the midtown area, and then the 6th and 7th corridor. So breaking those apart into kind of separate study areas. And then we added Valley River Center and Barger Drive, which were not identified in the CFA study, but because of a lack of frequent transit or because of their size, but they have similar zoning and opportunities. So I'm going to just hand it off to Elena quickly to give us a little perspective on what our growth monitoring data can tell us about redevelopment opportunities.
All right, so what can our growth monitoring redevelopment data tell us? As a reminder, this is a recap of redevelopment data that you've already looked at for the 2023 annual report. And we're a little over halfway into the monitoring period, about 12 years. So looking at the data can show us trends on developed land in the adopted BLI to see what's redeveloping, as well as trends on commercial and high density residential plan designations, which is largely where we're focusing our study areas for the redevelopment analysis. However, I do want to note that the redevelopment analysis focuses on zoning, whereas our growth monitoring data focuses on plan designation, which generally, but not always, matches the zoning. And so some of the high level redevelopment takeaways from our data: housing on developed commercial and or high density residential land tends to be more dense. So the total dwellings on developed land has already exceeded the forecast. Almost half are on commercial developed, and dwellings on high density residential developed land is almost also at the forecast. Eugene has seen commercial and high density residential housing use less acres of developed land than expected. So even though, so we're seeing really dense development, but it's not using as many acres as we had expected on developed. And then the total downtown area, the dwellings are on pace to meet that forecast, but that's mostly without taking advantage of the MUPD or urban renewal incentives. And then employment efficiency measures on developed land are well below the forecast pace, which also include development downtown and utilizing urban renewal. So that's some context on redevelopment trends before Becky starts talking about sort of the more forward-looking redevelopment analysis.
Thanks, Lena. So I just threw a ton of information at you, a long presentation. We're gonna, I think, pause, see what questions you have about climate-friendly areas, thoughts, feedback, and then when we're ready, we'll hand it over to Becky to talk about redevelopment.
Great. Questions? Sue?
I don't actually have a question. I just have a comment. What I like about this is that it's so intuitive. You know, it just makes sense. There's nothing in here that's a big surprise. And I think you could ask almost anybody in the community, where should this stuff happen? And they would agree with your findings. You could have saved a whole lot of effort just by asking Rick. And he could have told you. But I think that's good news that it's, you know, there's no big surprise here. And anybody who's lived here for more than 6 months would know that these are the areas that make sense. So I think that's reassuring.
Great.
Thanks, you.
Phil?
Couple of questions. Do nodal development areas factor into this at all? Previously identified nodal development areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did not start with the nodal development areas. I think it seems to be mixed results in terms of how well some of those areas are kind of living up to the promise of nodal development. So I think some of them are reflected here, but not necessarily all of them. And maybe Heather can speak more to this, but I think ongoing conversations about what happens with nodal development now that the state has kind of this new mandate and new requirements around CFAs. Nodal development is kind of the old state requirements and language, and if and how we might want to make them play together in the future.
So let me understand. I mean, there were
Mhm.
some areas that were identified in the CFA areas that you then took off of the redevelopment areas map because maybe they already are redeveloping or they already are seeing some development. Would there be any harm in including those areas that aren't fully built out, aren't maybe finished redeveloping? And you
Yeah.
kind of take advantage of kind of the gravity and momentum to meet this state requirement, because especially since if some of these nodal development areas that have been previously identified as aspirational 20-minute neighborhoods haven't been built out and you're not going to count them, how are you going to meet these objectives that the state has about how many new jobs, how many new people are going to be living within these areas?
Yeah, that's a great clarification. Even though we're not including those areas in the redevelopment analysis, doesn't mean they're off the table for climate friendly areas. So we just didn't include them in this specific analysis because the evidence shows that they are redeveloping. We don't necessarily need a new like incentive to encourage that redevelopment. But they're certainly still on the table as climate friendly areas. So yeah, that's a good clarification.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that just because development has occurred in some of those areas, that it doesn't still need it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because you're gonna, obviously what you're gonna be doing here is you're gonna be picking winners where some places are gonna be getting benefits to develop or redevelop, some places are not. So, I mean, some places are gonna need it a lot more. If you're gonna build on Highway 99 or Far West 11th, that is a big lift. So I kind of have a little bit of, you know, reservation about the fact of those areas being identified as aspirationally areas that would be redeveloped into more housing and more employment. When I'm just sort of a practical person, and I think that maybe it would be time better spent to focus upon those walkable areas that have a leg up instead of wholly recasting strip commercial areas that go on for a couple of miles. That's good. That's a big lift.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think it's for the areas that we included for the redevelopment analysis. I think it's more about what would the redevelopment analysis tell us about like downtown Riverfront, for example, that we aren't already seeing through kind of the ongoing redevelopment down there. Those areas are certainly still on the table for designating as climate friendly areas and potentially introducing incentives along with that. We just didn't think the redevelopment analysis would tell us any new information for those areas that are kind of actively redeveloping. To your point around some of these like strip mall, Highway 99, very auto oriented areas, I think you're right. It's a much bigger lift than just like some minor tweaks to the zoning to actually see those come into being climate friendly areas. And we didn't really do any of that type of narrowing at this stage. They're zoned similarly to like downtown, but they certainly have different markets. So I think what we're hoping the redevelopment analysis helps to show is like, even with CFA designation, even with potentially other incentives on top of that, some of these areas still are not ripe to be dense, mixed use, walkable areas right now. And that will help us to kind of focus on where we want to designate in this round.
Okay, thanks.
Heather?
That's exactly, yep, you said it. Just that this is the first time we're doing it, right? And so, you know, we don't have unlimited budget. And there's a lot of places, you know, that would be of interest to look at for development, potential redevelopment. But we just don't have unlimited budget for this. And we know we're going to be doing this more on a regular basis. And so trying to be judicious, but on the other hand, I think this is really good feedback. We want to hear this stuff, so.
Okay, I put myself in the queue. So I just want to understand a little bit. So 30% of our increase needs to be in CFAs. So
30, yeah, our CFAs have to be zoned to accommodate 30% of our current and future housing needs. So current units on the ground plus projected future housing need, and 30% of that total. But what the state requires is that it's a zoned capacity. So it basically says like wipe away anything that's on the ground and build it out to the maximum that the zoning would allow as a CFA. And that has to get us to 30%. So it's not we're not required by the state, I should say, to do kind of a realistic capacity. But we have to meet that 30% threshold, which
So-
from like our, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
well, yeah, and I understand that. I'm just wondering how that plans into our urban growth boundary analysis. You know, is that we have to take that 30% out at the very beginning and say, no, we're gonna fill 30% of it with CFAs, and then we can go from there and see if we need to have an expansion. And we have to use efficiencies to get to that 30% in CFAs before we can start looking at anything else.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We have to meet the 30% threshold for CFAs, but to use CFAs as a land use efficiency measure, we'll have to follow the same process of estimating realistic redevelopment potential in CFAs. So those two estimates, I think, will be different. We'll say like, we're zoning CFAs, we're exceeding this 30% threshold set by the state. And realistically, we think we've zoned CFAs to accommodate this increase in efficiency. That gets incorporated into the UGB analysis. So there will kind of be like two different capacity estimates.
Good. And that makes me feel a little more comfortable. I mean, I'm afraid of having, you know, the phantom buildability, developability
Mhm.
that we've seen in some of our other analyses. The zones that you saw that you're studying, I'm encouraged by that. I'm most encouraged by the Midtown one, because there's been a lot of interest in Midtown, but it sits outside the downtown core. And so a lot of the incentives that are available to downtown core that would work really well in the Midtown area are unavailable. So I'm hoping that that is looked at, because I know of a couple developers that have properties there that said, you know, if I could, I would redevelop this property, but right now it just doesn't work for me. And so I'm encouraged by that as somebody who used to own a business in that area, know the density that it's proximity to with West University. There are so many bodies in that area that could use a walkable neighborhood, and it has a lot of the amenities that are already there, and redevelopment in that area seems like a no-brainer for me. So thanks.
That's great feedback.
Anybody else with questions or comments, Rick? All right, do we want to move on to the next section?
I see Phil's hand.
Oh, go ahead, Phil.
I'll just again reiterate, I think that there are other areas that were included in the CFAC map, taken off of the redevelopment map. I don't understand quite why, for the same reasons that that were just pointed out, that they may be really suitable areas for redevelopment and achieving all of these objectives that the CFAC and CFA intend to meet.
Is there
Instead, those incentives are going to be available to areas that are going to be far less likely to become those true walkable areas. So I'm just sort of encouraging you to take a viewpoint of practicality. Areas that have big populations of people, the zoning is right. It met so many of these other criteria that you set up, yet you're not including them in the redevelopment areas. I don't get it.
Phil, what areas specifically are you thinking?
Well, a couple, in particular, the Franklin and
Mhm.
Walnut Station, but then also on the other side of the river, areas that are around heavily transited, trafficked areas, with a lot of potential for further redevelopment, I think around Harlow Road, Martin Luther King, even, you know, that area further east and north of Coburg Road.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Those are great points. The kind of Chase Village area, part of the reason that we didn't include it in the redevelopment analysis is because the zoning is really different there, and it would require pretty significant changes since it's more of that high density residential as compared to mixture of uses, but that's really good feedback. Definitely will take that on board. I think the Walnut Station area certainly is still on the table as I should say they both still are on the table as potential areas to designate as CFAs. So your point is well taken.
All right, Rick, I saw your hand. Great.
So I'm going to sort of echo what Phil was talking about. I mean, the Walnut Street, or excuse me, the Crescent Village area. I mean, you've got jobs, you've got housing, you've got stores. I mean, I shop there myself, and there's a lot of people that already walk and move and so on. After your discussion on John's comment, it would seem to me that's just a no-brainer to include that area as one that really adds the numbers that you will be looking for versus trying to get into some of these other areas. And I understand they may disappear from the ultimate choice, but it just seems like that whole area was, although it was called node, I mean, zone changes aren't that hard to do. We make zone changes all the time. It's pretty straightforward to get it, particularly if it's existing and it's not going to affect the ability for somebody to redevelop in the area, which I think that area is just a nodal PUD or PD area now zoned. And so nodes don't really exist. We've wiped those out a couple of decades ago. So it just seems reasonable to me to kind of throw that into the pot. Thanks.
Rick, are you thinking of Chase Village on MLK or Crescent
I'm
Village
sorry,
on
Crescent
Coburg?
Village.
Crescent Village on Coburg.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Crescent
and
Village.
Crescent Village has come up a few times internally as definitely a good area for us to be considering as a CFA. It is zoned similarly to these other areas of C2. And the only reason it didn't actually make it into the study was because it doesn't have frequent transit access now, interestingly, but that doesn't mean we can't zone it as a CFA. It was just one of our early narrowing factors. So it's great feedback. Okay.
How did the land on Chad Drive, the employment zoning, how did that fall into being restricted or being able to fit it?
We did not look at areas zoned E1 and E2 for the CFA study since residential is not, or I should say it's not designated for residential use. That certainly those areas are under consideration for other efficiency measures to look at how well those are performing. If there's a need to change those zones or change what some of the uses are or what they're designated for, I think that's on the table, and Heather could talk more about that, but they weren't included in this study just because of that residential piece.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? If not, we'll move on to the Echo Northwest portion of this.
Thanks.
Becky, you're up.
Okay, just got back with the cough drop. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so I'm mostly fine. But if I like have to mute myself for a second, it's because I'm having a coughing fit. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we're doing in the redevelopment analysis and some of the things we are seeing so far. We are early in doing the analysis. And so we have collected some initial data. We have been talking to some folks in the development community, including a couple folks who are on this call. and a couple of others. And so we're just sort of sharing some of our early work and giving you guys a chance for feedback on what we're seeing so far. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach, what we've heard from the developer interviews in particular, what we've heard about the different study areas. You guys hit on a lot of the things already, so I'll move through that a little bit quickly, but I want to give you guys a chance to weigh in on some of them in more detail. And then what we're seeing that would drive redevelopment in these different areas for the different types of development we're looking at. We're looking at a range of different types of development, redevelopment, from mixed use, 5 to 7 story buildings, standalone, single use residential apartments that are 5 or 6 stories, have an elevator, walk-up apartments and garden apartments around 3 stories. We're also looking at student-oriented housing, like 12 stories, but more like what's been built kind of right around campus recently. And then we'll also be looking at townhouses and a couple of variations on standalone commercial development. And this gets at kind of the range of uses that are allowed and intended to be allowed for these CFAs. We're looking at a couple of different variables that might affect redevelopment. So changes to regulations. As Leah mentioned, the regulatory changes, because the city is focusing on areas where the regulations already align pretty well with what's required for CFAs, the regulatory changes are pretty minor that are under consideration, but could be some streamlining of permitting, making things permitted outright, establishing a minimum density, and allowing single unit detached or townhouses in the C3 zone. We're also looking at the impact of some potential financial incentives, looking at how MUFD, if it were applied in new areas, how that might affect feasibility. City's also considering adjusting how MUFD works in the downtown, which we won't be able to like really detailed capture what that might mean for feasibility, but we can incorporate some thoughts about that into the analysis. And then also looking at potentially some fee assistance for downtown within the urban renewal area. And then the other thing that we can play around with a little bit is what might happen if there were investments in streetscape or other things that might make these areas more desirable, that might make market rents come up. So we can test, sort of do some sensitivity testing of like, well, this is where we think the rents would be given current conditions, but what if things changed kind of in the public sphere? How might that change what rents would be achievable there? So our feasibility analysis is going to take in those estimated market rents for each area, our estimate of cost for development, information about the size and value of the existing properties in each of these areas, and then the existing and potential policy, the zoning and the incentives. And those things are going to combine to give us an estimate of redevelopment potential for each sub area. So we have been collecting some information about existing rents. There are not great comparable developments in all of these places. Some of them have not had recent development for a long time. So we've used the data that we do have, and then some feedback from folks to kind of get a feel for how different might these rents be and which areas are most likely to command the highest rents. And so our areas that, based on the data we have and what we heard from folks in the development community, was that the 3 areas that were most likely to command high residential rents were Midtown, South Willamette, and Lower Coburg Road. And we'll talk about those areas a little bit more later. The other thing to note is that the potential rents also vary depending on the type of housing. So student-oriented housing has a different market, and in the places where it makes a lot of sense, it can achieve a different rent than housing that's targeted towards the general population. You would also see potentially different rents for garden apartments versus more elevator served apartments, and depending on whether it's like a garden apartment with a pool or like a playground and like amenities and all this stuff, or if it's just like a basic woody walk up that's just a building and a parking lot, doesn't have a bunch of amenities. So there's factors that would make this rent higher or lower for different types of development. But we gave an example here in the chart on the right, just to give a sense of kind of the rough range that we are seeing for example, like a 1-bedroom across these areas. We also collected some information about the parcels that are included within this redevelopment analysis for each of the study areas. And one of the factors we looked at was site size. That matters for the redevelopment analysis, both because there are some types of development that really only can physically fit on a larger site. For example, garden apartment developments need a certain amount of room to really work and make sense. And then also because even for more dense types of development, if you have a combination of a larger site and a strong market, that can make it more appealing for outside investors. So we took a look, and you've got some of these areas, the ones that kind of have a more, you can kind of see the era in which these different study areas were developed. Some of the more auto-oriented ones have a lot of large parcels. They're not all large, but they do have a lot of large parcels. And then some of the other ones that are more like that historic grid network are mostly small parcels, and there's just a handful of larger ones. We also took a look at the existing property value on a per square foot basis. So this matters because if a property is really high value today, you are a lot less likely to be able to acquire that property, tear down whatever's on it, and replace it with something else. So this is cut off. There's the property values go far up, like greater downtown, the numbers go up to like $1,000, $2,000 a square foot. We cut that off because that is completely irrelevant to a redevelopment analysis. There is no way that that is going anywhere. So we focused in just for this visual on sort of a lower end. I will say $100 a square foot is not a magic number. It was just a reference point. That is still a very high number from a redevelopment perspective to think that someone would be able to buy a property that is even at $100 a square foot. Like that would be, I would be surprised if we said redevelopment would be feasible on a property that is currently valued at $100 a square foot in any of these areas. It would take a very that would be very, very feasible. So you can see that like that percentage number, that's what percentage of the parcels in that area are have an existing value based on the assessor, which is an imperfect source of information about property value, but it is available for every parcel. So we're using it as a rough proxy. And so it gives you a sense that like in the downtown area, you have a relatively small percentage of your parcels that are even under $100 a square foot. And if you look where those pretty much things to the left of those percentage numbers, those are more likely to be in the zone. And there's like one dot that's probably an error because it's zero value. So there's pretty much nothing in that downtown core that has a low property value, which tells us if anything was going to redevelop in that downtown core, it's going to have really high rents to be able to, or a bunch of incentives to be able to afford to redevelop those sites. When we look at Highway 99 down on the bottom, 98% of the parcels are valued at under $100 a square foot. Most of them are to the left of the $50 a square foot. That doesn't mean that redevelopment is going to be super feasible there, because it might be that development can afford $0 a square foot in that area, or $2 a square foot, or $10 a square foot, and that it only works on vacant sites, and maybe then still only with incentives, and maybe it doesn't really make sense at all. So this is just one input. Really, it's the combination of higher rents and finding those couple of lower priced existing properties, those are the sites where you would expect to see redevelopment potential. So this just gives a little bit of an idea of what we're working with as far as a starting point. Okay, I'm going to pause there. We're going to talk about some of the things we heard from developers and the individual study areas, but I'll just pause for a second. Does anyone have questions on how we're approaching this or any of the data that I just showed before we move on?
John, you're muted.
Said I can't see all of those. There you go. So if you raise your hand, you jump to the top and I can see you. So Sue, go ahead.
I just have a comment again. I have a lot of comments, but I think this is really a watershed moment in terms of city staff consciousness about what it takes for development. Having been on the other side of the equation as a real estate broker, and my husband was a developer, I think there's always been a challenge to understand whether staff understood what it takes to develop. And I think this is really fantastic that you actually know that just having a great site in a great location, even a great site with high rents, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to develop. It could take a lot of incentives for that just to happen. And I find this very comforting that you all understand that, because I think that really makes it possible for the decision makers to make good decisions about incentives and to understand what it is like from a developer's perspective. So I really appreciate this information. Thank you.
Yeah, I will dovetail on that. When I first read this memo, I was like, wait a second, people are actually looking and seeing what it costs to develop a property and make it work. And the other thing that is shocking to me that I haven't heard is the fact that high rents aren't a bad thing necessarily. You know, that there is a place in our community for a rent that can sustain development. And for so long, that has not really been reflected in the jargon that I've heard coming out of policymakers and even out of staff. So this is very encouraging for me.
Okay, I will. I was going to say I can keep going, and then if folks have questions as I go, I'll pause one other time before I get to the end, after we get through this section of individual study areas. But if there's something that you're like, hold up, what did you say? What are you talking about? Feel free to just raise your hand and I'll pause and catch your questions.
Sounds good.
All right. Okay. So from the developer interviews that we have done so far, we pulled out these kind of like bigger picture themes that are relevant to this work. First, that amenities matter, that's not, we had talked a little bit about what the city is and isn't required to consider in doing the CFA designations. The city is not really required to think about amenities per se. I mean, we have to think about parks and things like that kind of more narrowly, but not in a broader sense. But what we heard is that is important. We heard, I think pretty universally, about the river as an amenity, and that a number of the places that were appealing because of their proximity to the river. We heard pretty universally that downtown is not considered an amenity right now, that it's maybe a disamenity, and that there wasn't really any perceived premium for being closer to downtown. So that's something that's a perception issue, right or wrong, but it's going to drive investment decisions. And that busy major roads are a problem for trying to put housing nearby. People don't want to build and don't want to live right next to a really busy major road, something that's 4 lanes and carrying a lot of traffic and it's hard to cross and all that kind of thing. And so I think a sort of vote for places that are already more walkable, that are maybe more appealing for higher intensity development. And we heard some folks feeling like BRT was, you know, a relevant driver, a relevant consideration, but also not a lot of value placed on the transit system, just in terms of how it drives demand, how it affects development potential, that it is a nice to have maybe, but not like, oh, well, now that there's BRT here, that changes everything, kind of just a small component. We heard overall, and this is not just in Eugene, that this is a tough time for development, and construction costs, you know, rose a lot in the last couple of years, and they haven't come down, even if they have kind of flattened out. Interest rates are really high right now. Oh geez, sorry, my computer really wants me to update right now. Go away, computer. Please let me keep doing what I'm doing. Okay, back. Okay. And something that we have heard in lots of places, and it came up actually in developer conversations that staff had previously, that we're mostly talking about rental housing when we're talking about taller housing here, because of construction defect liability challenges that affect condominiums. And so that really limits the range of things that you could build in this shape of tall stacked apartment or tall stacked units, multifamily. We heard some sort of willingness to think about reduced parking ratios, but also some concerns about that. Maybe some more interest in sort of creative solutions, that there's a need for people to like put their cars somewhere, but they might not be driving them all the time. So maybe there's some tolerance to put them a little bit further away, a little bit less convenient, or have some shared parking or things like that, but not to necessarily lose access to parking entirely. There's concern about how neighborhoods would react. So if there was any sort of discretionary anything involved in the development, that having a reduced parking ratio was really going to be a deal killer. And generally sort of the zone that we heard some openness to was roughly between a half a space per unit and a space per unit. There are a couple of developments that push below that. And so I think it's not a hard limit, but I think when we're thinking about the outlying areas in particular, it would probably be hard to get below that. So in terms of comments from the specific areas, I mentioned some of the perception issues that affect downtown. A number of people mentioned perception issues associated with people experiencing homelessness in the downtown area, in the downtown core in particular. And that commercial rents were not particularly high in this area, except in some pretty limited pockets where more of a attraction and amenity has been created. But that overall, it just wasn't really seen as a draw. 6th and 7th Avenue, you've got a grid network, but you've got a busy street. And so that makes it overall pretty auto-oriented. It's pretty wide right of way. You do have bus rapid transit, but it's not necessarily come to a place that is very like transit friendly. It's just the place where the transit is. And so there was some skepticism about the redevelopment potential here, between having, you know, not very big parcels and not really seen as a big amenity. West 11, again, concerns about walkability and traffic. And also note that, you know, even where you've got sites that might be relatively low value from a real estate in perspective, that you've got businesses operating out there. And so even if a site is relatively low value, if the business in it is doing great and they got no reason to move, and they're not going to go out of business, then that site doesn't become available for redevelopment, even if the value of it would be relatively low. And we heard that the south side of this area, especially south of the creek, was potentially more desirable, a little bit buffered from the busy street, the creek and the trail as an amenity. But that is outside of our study area, unfortunately. Midtown, you heard folks talking about this a little bit, potentially more desirable in the downtown core, getting some kind of interest and investment there, reuse of older buildings. Sometimes that's a good kind of precursor to ground up redevelopment, and a little more retail demand in that area. South Willamette, we heard was pretty desirable, kind of had good access to lots of things that people like to have nearby, and has relatively higher rents. Lower Coburg Road, also called Ferry Street Bridge sometimes in our maps. The proximity to river and campus ranked high as amenities. The roads are large and chop this area up quite a bit. And the existing buildings are not terribly old, so that affects how likely they are to get redeveloped. And we also heard there might be some floodplain issues in this area, but some maybe potential for redevelopment, which I would say, based on what we heard, I think we might be more adjacent to this area than within the actual parcels that are included in this area. The Valley River Center, you've got the proximity to the river. We heard about some greenway permitting challenges that had affected previous development efforts there, and I don't know enough details to know whether recent code changes have resolved that or not. We heard some potential for infill on the mall parking lots. This is something that I'll just flag. You can kind of see the parcel lines here on the Valley River Center. A parcel-based analysis is going to do a poor job of assessing redevelopment potential for parcels where you have a piece of a mall building and then a parking lot, and they're a little more integrated than you know, most parcels. Like most parcels are a little bit more sort of standalone than that, and so this is an area that we'll have to kind of pay close attention to and make sure we're using our analysis appropriately and not saying like, oh yeah, you're just going to tear down the middle of the mall, but then you're going to leave the Macy's standing, or something that's sort of objectively ridiculous. And then we also heard there could be some infrastructure challenges. I also know some other places that have redeveloping malls, particularly in places that also have water of any kind. Stormwater management can be a real challenge for redevelopment. So that's something else that might come up here. The Santa Clara Station area, you've got the site next to the station itself. And then folks mentioned a couple of churches nearby that maybe might have some property that potentially could be used for affordable housing specifically, and relatively strong retail rents in this area. And then Highway 99, folks have heard some of this already. And I'm sure you know it, but just because of it being not walkable, being a busy road, being an area that that is a lower income neighborhood, and because it's a lower income area because it's not necessarily the most desirable, so that's where it's more affordable to live. And that's an indicator of what your potential rents might be, what your potential demand might be for this area. Also some concern about folks experiencing homelessness and the services on this area, and then having adjacent properties that are maybe not in the best of condition, which makes them, if you have areas where property values have been more depressed, where things aren't in great conditions, and then that changes, then you can see a lot of redevelopment potential. But the conditions really have to change. You have to see things become more desirable than they have been. Barger Drive is a really small area. It's just a handful of properties. And we heard this is an area where the businesses are doing pretty well right now. They're serving their local community, which is kind of more of a moderate lower income area, but not necessarily an obvious choice for redevelopment to multifamily. So that's That's just some of the factors we heard here. I'm gonna talk a little bit about what we heard, what it means for different types of development. But before I do that, I know folks, many of y'all have lived in this area for a long time. So if you have thoughts about these areas and you wanna throw them out there now, we can pause here for those comments.
Sue?
I have a question about how you obtain this data, because to me it sounds very accurate based on my own understanding about commercial development, residential development. I'm just curious about who you talked to, how you got them, and how many sessions you had, and because it's very comprehensive data, and curious about how you got it.
Glad to hear it. Sounds like it's in line with what you heard. Sorry, my dog is being a little ridiculous over here right now. So you hear some growling in the background. It isn't me. We talked to a couple of folks. I mentioned we talked to Rick. We talked to Phil. We also talked to I think 2 other people. We have 1 more scheduled next week. So talked to a couple of different folks that have different types of development experience in the area. And yeah, there were some differences of opinion, and then a lot of common themes that we heard. We did also look at CoStar, which has information that is, it's something, it's imperfect. And then our sort of property level information comes from the assessor. So it's a mixture of the available data and then triangulating based on what we've heard from folks who know this area really well and who have done development and thought about development in this area.
That's
Phil.
great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Phil, you're up.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question and then maybe give a comment. The redevelopment work here, and I guess, is it different from what we were talking about before in that, is it purely looking at redevelopment of sites for housing alone, or does it also include the concept of either horizontal or vertical mixed use development? Okay.
Good
So-
question. And so the answer is yes,
Okay.
both horizontal and mixed use. A little bit more emphasis on residential, but we are looking at all of these things.
Okay. And my comment would just be that, I think, honestly, of all of these types of the typology of housing here, the most difficult is the vertical mixed use. I mean, it really takes a very unique circumstance of place, good fortune, proximity to a variety of other things. The one at the top image here of the Amazon corner, terrific. And it was repurposing a site that formerly had a church. It's right behind a grocery store. It's got a clinic across the street, bike path. It's got everything. It's just such an ideal location. And but still not an easy thing to execute, and it's not affordable. It's not cheap. So it's a difficult proposition. So I just caution all of us to temper our aspirations for some alley of the Champs-Élysées of West 11th or Highway 99 having boutique shops with housing above. May not occur quite that way. So
That is a great segue to the next section of my presentation. Do folks have other thoughts, or should I? Okay, I was going to say I can jump to that, but I'm happy to hear other comments.
One more comment that I see with the mapping and the dollar amount for redevelopment is how that impacts the other part of CFAC, which is displacement. Right? If redevelopment happens where it's cheap on Highway 99, Bethel, all of that, it's gonna run right up against the other pillar of CFAC, which is displacement. So we're gonna have to incentivize development to put it there, and then we're gonna have to incentivize the people that we're displacing. So I don't know how those two mix. That's
I'll let Leah jump in here too. I think it's an important point, and that I think something that we might want to think about as we identify redevelopment potential is what do we know about the sites that seem to have redevelopment potential? We're not doing a like real site by site opportunity study type of thing. We're really digging in on site conditions, but what types of properties look more viable for redevelopment? Are they places where small businesses are located today? Are they places where you have lower cost apartments located today? What kinds of existing uses might be displaced? Or maybe they're like not really a whole lot of anything. You know, they're like a shed and some outdoor storage, and it's like, it's fine. But I think thinking about what is it that could be replaced through redevelopment, and is that a concern from a displacement perspective, or not? I think that the places where you would worry about it are if you had lower cost rental housing, where the people who would be displaced are not the ones making the decision about whether redevelopment happens. That would be a concern. Or potentially small businesses. You know, if you had like a small strip center and you had a bunch of small businesses in there, and like they're doing fine, their business is going great, it's just not a super high rent. That would be the other type of displacement concern I think you'd want to worry about. Leah, did you want to chime in on that?
I'll just add, thanks for bringing it up, John. I think I would co-sign what Becky has said, that when we are looking a little bit more specifically at which areas we're going to designate, looking at those area conditions and thinking about what the displacement risks are. We did a citywide displacement risk analysis as part of the CFA study. I won't get into a ton of detail, but so we have a little bit to start on. But I think our focus will be in this whole suite of work is, I don't think whether there's a strong risk of housing displacement is something we can really tell from that displacement risk analysis, you know, specific to CFA designation, but we will want to take seriously what the city can do to help mitigate displacement, whether that be related to CFAs or just citywide in general. What can we do to lower the risk of displacement or help to stabilize the most vulnerable households? And so we'll be thinking about that through the course of all this work. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Feel free to, like I said, chime in, raise your hand, stop me if there's other things. Okay, so this is, like I said, we have not crunched all the numbers yet. We are still collecting information to help us dial in our assumptions. We still have another developer review to do, but just based on the work we've done so far, we put some thoughts together about what we think the potential is and the challenges are going to be for the different types of development. So elevator apartments, 5-6 story, no ground floor retail. Some things they need to work. You need areas with relatively higher rents. That tends to be a higher cost construction type to get, you know, the cost of the elevator. It's not super high cost necessarily. You're usually still wood frame, but relatively higher rents than it takes to make a just 3-story building work. So it needs to be a more desirable kind of higher amenity area. And if you're thinking about a place where people would be like, yeah, I want to live in a tall building in a small unit, you know, like what are the places where people would think that specifically? That's where this is more likely to work. So some of the places that seem, based on what we know so far, like more likely candidates, again, this is not to say that there will actually be sites that are feasible for it. It's just where we think, you know, maybe if the site conditions were right, it might have a chance. Maybe Lower Coburg, maybe Midtown, maybe South Willamette. 5 to 7 story mixed use, I agree with everything folks have said about the challenges of mixed use development. That is true of every time we have looked at mixed use development. In most places, it really does take the combination of a walkable higher amenity area that supports the residential rents and a place that supports the commercial, where, you know, small businesses that would fit in a small ground floor retail space are going to be able to survive. So, and because of the higher cost, both of going into having some concrete on the first floor or two, or just the cost of integrating retail and the additional complexity that comes with that, they tend to require higher rents than standalone residential development. And the places where we thought maybe this might be viable, based on what we know so far, maybe Midtown, maybe South Willamette, and maybe parts of greater downtown, maybe not all of greater downtown, but maybe in some places. Garden apartments, I mentioned they need some land in the bigger site, because partly because of that, they're more of a vacant land play than a redevelopment play. But, you know, maybe there's some sites that have that are pretty minimally developed that might kind of pass muster here. And the garden apartments, the ones we're thinking about, you know, this is again something with some amenities. So these are apartments that are going for a moderate to higher rent, you know, a place that I think of them as being a sort of relatively attractive semi-suburban location is where they're happiest. So the places that stood out to me, Valley River Center in particular, maybe Santa Clara, and maybe a few spots on West 11th, maybe. Compact walk-ups, these are a little more basic. They don't really have a bunch of amenities. Their rents are typically not real high. They need a pretty low cost site. They don't need a real big site. Can tuck into some slightly weird spots. They're not trying to command premium rents kind of no matter where they are. So they can work better in some of those places that have kind of just barely work kind of market conditions, where there is a need for that more moderately priced rental product. And so where, you know, it's got to kind of strike that balance where somebody would be willing to pay a little bit more to be in a new apartment versus an old apartment, but, you know, they're willing to tolerate not having all of the amenities and not having, you know, super fancy place to live. So the places where that seemed like maybe a fit, maybe parts of West 11th, maybe 6th and 7th Avenues, maybe some spots on Highway 99. Those are kind of where we're thinking the conditions seem more promising. The high-rise student-oriented apartments, this one feels like kind of an obvious one. They want to be close to campus, right? I mean, you're not going to build student-oriented apartments miles and miles away from campus. That's not how it works. But on top of that, these are more premium student housing. There's plenty of less premium student housing out there. These are pretty premium. So they want to be in a place that is both close to campus and pretty nice. And so this would be maybe parts of greater downtown, maybe Midtown. We're not looking right up against the university, but, you know, kind of the parts of these areas that are closer to the university are more likely to be where the student-oriented apartments would go. Townhouses. So townhouses, there's a range of, you know, how fancy townhouses might be. They can be kind of more on the moderately priced range. They can be a little bit more luxury. So a relatively desirable area, they typically can't do real high land costs. So they're more of a vacant land or small infill site that had a shed on it or something like that. Not a tear down a real big building and replace it with townhouses generally. So places, and they can handle a relatively small site. I mean, if you can stick 4 townhouses together, sometimes that works. So Places that have these kind of smaller infill sites might work. So maybe some parts of Midtown, maybe some of greater downtown, maybe there's some sites on West 11th, maybe some of our other areas as well. I mean, 5th, 6th, there could be other spots where, you know, maybe kind of not right on the busy street, but on like the back half of the block or things like that. There might be some little pockets. Storefront commercial. So this would be more of a like pedestrian oriented commercial, less of a box. So it's going to want to be in a walkable area. It wants to be around other retail. It wants to have some energy to it. It also is going to want to be close to places with concentrations of people, whether that's residents, employees, or both, students, whatever. So some places where that might maybe be, you know, maybe you might see some infill of things like that. Midtown, maybe South Willamette, parts of greater downtown. And then freestanding commercial, think like Walgreens on, you know, just like a building and a parking lot. And, you know, maybe it's located towards the front or whatever, the parking's on the side, but it's still basically just like a building and a parking lot. They're looking for high visibility, high accessibility from major roads. Busy roads are just fine. Those are great, like those fine, but they need lower cost land. So some of the places where you might see that kind of slotted into, you know, where maybe you've got parking lots today, or maybe you've got just sort of a weird little site that would get replaced with something else. Maybe Santa Clara, maybe Valley River Center, maybe Barger Drive. It could also be something where you might see like commercial infill as, you know, parking lots being repurposed with additional commercial buildings added to the site without tearing down existing buildings. And some other thoughts, just to keep in mind with sort of what the redevelopment analysis can tell us. There might be situations where commercial would be replaced with commercial, but unless it increases the intensity, we are not going to see new capacity out of it. So it doesn't really matter from the perspective of thinking about capacity and what would fit within the UGB, and, you know, whether we're accommodating 20 years worth of growth. Also, since we've got some areas that are pretty auto-oriented, that do not really have the conditions today that makes a higher intensity redevelopment obvious, they might need changes to the public realm. They might need street to be skinnier and more walkable. They might need other amenities nearby. So it might take things that are not exactly what's on the table for this study to make them more likely to redevelop. I mentioned, you know, redevelopment requires high rents and or low property values. And there's a lot of places with both. That's not an accident, right? If they're desirable, they're more likely to have valuable existing buildings on them. But so given how much of these study areas are developed, I mean, that was the point. It's a redevelopment analysis. Vacant land, we're just assuming it develops. But these are pretty developed. Most stuff has like real buildings on it. So I think I would agree with the tempering of expectations of how much stuff we're going to see that could redevelop really in a lot of these areas. And also because the regulatory changes are limited, the CFA designation itself is going to have a pretty subtle impact. That by itself, probably not going to do much. So it's really a question of what are the places where financial incentives would make a big difference? And would they make a big difference that like gets the city like, yes, that's what we want, that really helps us achieve our goals? Or does it mostly get you displacement and doesn't result in the types of development you really want? So that's sort of what we'll be looking at. I just want to note, since we talked a little bit about the incentives, the city has done some engagement already with development community about incentives for the downtown area specifically, gathered some feedback about MUPTI and fee assistance. They are all things that are exactly what I would have expected to hear from the development community on these things. Preference to make sure that exemption is the full 10 years allowed under statute, that it would be great to expand to a larger area, that, you know, more community benefits is going to eat into the value of the incentive. That's not to say you couldn't push it a little more necessarily, but that there's a trade-off there. an interest in potentially allowing it to apply to 4-unit projects versus 5 and above. For fee assistance, focusing the assistance to fewer projects, but a deeper incentive versus spreading it more thinly. And then some other potential incentives that folks threw out in terms of expedited permitting, maybe funding for site preparation, and then a caution to be careful that the way the city supports investment does not result in triggering prevailing wage requirements that can increase construction costs. I think that's all I have. We've talked some about your observations about the study areas already, but do folks have any other questions or comments?
I am looking for hands. I had one question about standalone commercial and why West 11th didn't make that list. It seemed to me that West 11th, especially between Bailey Hill and Bertelson, has a lot of areas that are, or a lot of buildings, but they're older. Some of them are just warehouse type buildings that could be developed more. You know, you see the anchors at the end with the Walmart and the Target. I'm wondering why that didn't make the commercial standalone as far as the study area.
I would say mostly just an oversight. I was including like 3 areas per thing, and I agree with you. I think that is a place where, yeah, if you've got some kind of underdeveloped site, that could make a lot of sense. So yeah, I would add that to our list. Thank you for that.
Other questions or comments? I can't see everybody, so there we go. Bill, Rick, Howard, we haven't heard from you tonight.
No, everything's good, and some of the other comments people have had echoed what I would have asked. So, thanks.
Mark.
Yeah, well, I'm impressed by the whole story, the way it's shaping up. One of my sort of general questions is, to what extent is it particularly appropriate to gear the analysis according to what the old hands who've lived here for a while and know about development think, versus choosing, or I'm not quite sure studying other areas and finding out what worked there, let's say, other areas, I mean like other cities, and pushing for some strategies. For example, building along transit corridors, I mean the BRT line, regardless of whether the currently existing businesses and developers in Eugene regard the BRT as a desirable corridor for whatever reasons they do or don't. My general impression is that existing transit corridors in many other cities around the world, many that I've visited, the transit corridors are very significant in providing desirable development areas. And so to what extent might you, in planning and executing this kind of longer range scheme, but find value in pushing approaches that are not necessarily springing forth from the existing body of knowledge that's here? And as part of this, I would say comparing Eugene to other places globally, and seeing what emerges from that about how to prioritize the approach, the particular features of the approach.
I love that question. I would say I don't have a complete answer for you, but we are talking, most of who we've talked to so far are folks that have lived and worked in Eugene for a really long time, and that's been super helpful to get grounded in, what are these areas like? And also we will be talking, one of our remaining developer interviews was with a firm that works more broadly, not just in Eugene. And so I'll be really interested to get their perspective. We're doing similar work with the city of Salem, and we've been doing a little bit of like asking folks as we're talking to developers that are working in Salem, like, hey, have you worked in Eugene? I thought about working in Eugene. So we're doing a little bit of sort of crossover of and thinking about what are we hearing different in Salem from what we're hearing in Eugene, and why. And I will say I heard some different things about Salem's downtown than I've heard about Eugene's downtown. And so I think that might be something that there might be some lessons learned from doing these two things at the same time. So we are looking a little bit, I think we have the opportunity to benefit from we'll also be doing some work with some Southern Oregon communities. We'll have some similar conversations that we're having in different parts, at least of Oregon, not global, not everywhere, but we'll have a few other sort of reference points to think about what's working in other places and why, and could it work in Eugene? So yeah, I think that it is important both to understand how are things perceived by the development community that is here and operating today. They're going to continue to be a big part of what gets built and what happens going forward. And also, how is it perceived by developers from outside the Eugene region? You're seeing more interest in Eugene from outside developers than I think you were, at least 10 years, 15 years ago, right? So it's more important, I think, at this point to understand how outside folks see development potential in Eugene than it might have been in the past. I guess the one other thing I would say in terms of BRT, we did a study for the city of Eugene a couple of years back on River Road that like really specifically tried to quantify the value of BRT and how we would expect it to affect real estate and development conditions in that area. And we could probably unearth that if you wanted to see it, but it was a couple % difference based on a review of a bunch of literature for something like bus rapid transit. And I think it matters. It matters whether your transit is really serving the place or it is just put in the place. And I think we tend to put transit in places based on what is feasible from the transit perspective and not necessarily what is optimal from a alignment with the land use and development potential perspective. And so sometimes that compromises compared to other places. I grew up in the Boston region. Transit in Boston is very different, and transit-oriented development in Boston is very different because the transit is in the places where the people already want it to be to a greater extent. So anything else that staff want to add on that?
No, that was a great summary. Thanks, Becky.
So I'll go ahead, Heather.
I think the only other thing I would add is that and you all, the EETAC, you all know this. The data is only going to be there to inform the policy discussion. It doesn't mean, it's kind of like getting back to what Leo was saying earlier, just because we're trying to, the redevelopment data analysis is trying to add more conversation to the next step, which will be the policy discussion. And so again, just because we're not maybe looking at analyzing a certain area and its improvement value and those kinds of things, doesn't mean that's not going to be an area that we designate as a climate friendly area, that the decision makers in the community say, yeah, we need, because it's part of the vision. So just getting out kind of what I think both Phil and Mark were kind of talking about is that this is one piece of the larger conversation that's going to have to happen. we have our Envision Eugene Community Vision. There's key transit corridors on it and core commercial areas. And that conversation is going to be evolving as we work on the comp plan, this phase 2 of the comp plan, which will incorporate climate friendly areas and this conversation that we're having right here. So I just want to make sure people understand. I just want to emphasize that this is just one piece. It's a very technical piece, and that's why we're bringing it to you to see if it makes sense. And so I'm not trying to like defend anything. I just want to make sure that you know that there is that larger question of, do we go ahead and designate a whole bunch of areas as climate friendly areas? And then the policymakers have this information to say, well, sure, based on community engagement, and where should incentives go? And maybe, and this is not, don't take this this is not, I'm not trying to say it, but like, as an example, you could say like, wow, the data shows that we would need a whole bunch of incentives to make this area redevelop. But the community and the decision makers are like, yeah, and we think we need to do that here, right? Like that's still to come, that conversation still to come. And that's what this can really help illuminate is, here's an area that is part of the vision. It only needs this kind of incentive. Here's an area that's part of the vision, but it needs a whole bunch of these incentives. Okay, so now what do you do with that? Where does it make sense to put your eggs in your basket today, knowing also that we're going to be revisiting this every 8 years? So I just kind of want to make sure that folks are aware of kind of the bigger conversation that is still going to need to happen. Thanks.
Yeah, I put myself in the queue. And that dovetails exactly into what I wanted to say was the next step at the policy level is where it gets squishy. I mean, this is a technical advisory committee and the data is awesome and we can use it and we understand it. But we've seen this before. Rick has seen it. I mean, you identified South Willamette in 4 or 5 slides. We saw what happened with the South Willamette plan 10 years ago. The neighbors blew it up. And so that's where I'm worried about the process for community engagement with people who may not be able to get all of this data and do it. And I'm hoping that the policymakers will listen and look at these data, like you just said, and say, okay, we can get to our goals, but, I'll speak frankly, Greg Evans, Highway 99 may not be the place where it happens. As much as you want it to happen out there, it may not happen because of physical and economic realities that are at play in our community. So that's where I'm worried about it going off the rails, is we come up with these great places, Midtown, Walnut Station, Ferry Street Bridge, Valley River, that make a whole bunch of sense. And then those communities say, not in my backyard. And we have to deal with that again. And so that's my real concern about this, is that we have good hard data that may not be utilized. Phil.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo something or build upon, what Mark said. I thought it was a great idea. We should try to glean what we can from other places. I would caution though that that we contemplate scale. So it's easy to sort of say, oh, well, man, I went on this great trip to Barcelona. Man, it was unbelievable, the walkable streets and transit or whatever. And it's like, wow, well, that is so much vastly bigger. So if we think about other communities that are similar in composition to ours, and as we see outside development that is, investment that's coming into town, it's kind of the other D1 college schools, it's we're a college town. And I think if we look at some of the companions and figure out, well, maybe it's like they have a sales tax, we don't, that their transit system is better funded that way. Maybe that'll never happen, that we never get a sales tax. But what other kind of tools do they have for that similarly sized community that's really making these kind of things and moving the dial there that we can borrow from? So I think it's a great suggestion. Thanks, Mark.
John, I just wanted to acknowledge that we do have an attendee with their hand up, but we are not taking public comment tonight orally. But if you have questions for staff or any comments that you want me to pass along to the rest of ETAC, I think you emailed me earlier tonight, so you have my contact information and you can shoot me an email.
Thanks for clarifying that. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I think we move on to, oh, go ahead.
Are you, sorry, if Becky, do you mind throwing up the final slide on the next steps? I can talk through those really quick and then I'll give it back to you, John.
That's where I was going, next
Oh,
steps.
perfect, sorry. Yeah, so this has been great conversation. Thank you all for your comments and feedback. This is super helpful as we're early in the process. Becky and her team will be continuing their work on the analysis, updating cost and revenue assumptions, testing those policies that we're starting to look at, both this kind of CFA changes as well as potential financial incentives by the sub areas, and then pulling those results together. We are planning to come back to you all in June with those results. So we're excited to do that and get your feedback and temperature checks on what those look like and if they're aligning with what you would expect. And then really throughout the rest of the spring and summer, we'll be working through kind of broader community engagement and any needed technical analysis on that climate friendly areas work. That is happening, not just the technical analysis of where these areas might be, but also some of the policy concept work happening within the comprehensive plan. So knowing that climate friendly areas are one tool in our toolbox, but we may have others to support kind of more complete neighborhoods, mixed use areas, walkable neighborhoods. So looking both at those broader policies with this kind of specific designation. And appreciate all your comments and thoughts on considerations as we do that engagement. We are looking to bring a work session on this to the Planning Commission in the fall to get a recommendation on climate friendly areas, and then hoping to get direction from City Council by the end of 2024. This redevelopment analysis results will certainly inform that, as well as what we hear from community engagement, whether there are areas that really don't align or shouldn't be considered, or areas that weren't included in the study or redevelopment analysis, but that we think should be on the table or are in alignment with our community vision. Then in 2025, we'll kind of work through the code amendments, the comprehensive plan policies, some of those implementation tools before this whole suite of work goes to council in 2026 for the adoption process. I think that's all I have for next steps. Heather, Elena, anything I missed? Becky?
I mean, we have next steps on the agenda, but I think this covers it really. If anyone has any questions on next steps that are on the agenda, please let us know. But mostly it's urban growth strategies for the next few months, with the exception of the annual report being compiled and coming back to you hopefully in May. Annual growth monitoring report.
We will not be meeting on May 2nd, the first Thursday of May. And we will hopefully be meeting on the second Thursday of May, as long as I get the report done. But yeah, we'll keep you updated.
Since this was a public meeting, could you send out the slide deck that you presented to us to have? I would really like to have that slide deck available without having to flick through a YouTube channel.
Yep, I can make sure Lena has that for you.
Great. It was great. It was a great presentation, and some of those slides are just wow. So thank you for all the hard work. I really appreciate it, and I think the rest of the committee does as well. Anything else, Heather? Or Elena, I think we've covered next steps, our next meetings. All of you staff who stayed late tonight, go take off early tomorrow and have a nice long weekend. And we'll see you in May.
We plan on it.
Thank you
Thanks.
all.
Thank
Great
you,
job.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks.